All right, ready for a deep dive that might just turn your head upside down? Today, we're going where most people wouldn't dare the world of yoga. But, not in the way you might think.
Oh, yeah. Lay it on me.
We're tackling a question that, frankly, makes me a little uncomfortable just saying it out loud. Is yoga evil?
Whoa, okay, so we're going there.
We are. And it all started when I came across this article, and I'm not gonna lie, the title hooked me instantly.
What's the title?
Is Yoga Evil? Unraveling the Myths and Misconceptions. It's from Morningscape Mindset Media. And I knew we had to dive in.
Yeah, that's definitely a head turner. I can see why you were intrigued. And, it is kind of ironic. Yoga is supposed to be all about peace and harmony, but it stirs up some serious controversy.
Which is exactly what we're gonna unpack. So the article kicks off by taking us way back to ancient India, where yoga originated. And it wasn't exactly about finding your zen in a trendy studio back then.
Right. You're talking thousands of years ago. Yoga was deeply embedded in spiritual traditions like Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism. It was about uniting the mind, body, and spirit, not just mastering a perfect downward dog.
Okay, so that's where that whole yoga is more than just the physical thing comes from.
Exactly. And the article even breaks down the Sanskrit word yuj. It means to unite or to join, really emphasizing that interconnectedness, that wholeness at the heart of yoga.
I'm starting to see why this gets so complicated, but how did we get from ancient spiritual practices to yoga studios popping up like coffee shops on every corner?
Well, the article draws a pretty clear distinction between those historical roots and how yoga is practiced today. The argument is that modern yoga can be as secular or as spiritual as the person practicing it wants it to be.
So for some, it's a killer workout, and for others, it's a pathway to, spiritual enlightenment.
Exactly. And that brings us to the heart of the debate. Why are some people, especially within conservative Christian communities, viewing yoga as incompatible with their faith?
That's where the article gets really interesting. It lays out three main concerns, and the first one revolves around specific yoga poses, like the sun salutation.
Yeah, the sun salutation. It's a pretty common sequence, but some people see it as inherently religious, almost like you're worshiping a Hindu deity.
So for people whose faith centers on worshiping one god, it can feel like a conflict, like they're crossing a line.
Right, and that fear of idolatry is a big part of it. Some Christian leaders are saying that even if you don't intend to worship another god, just by doing these poses, you could be seen as doing just that.
It's a perspective that makes you think, for sure. But there's another layer to this whole concern, and it has to do with the language used in yoga.
You're talking about the mantras like Om and Namaste.
Exactly. You hear those words everywhere these days, not just in yoga studios.
Right. They've kind of gone mainstream. But for some people, chanting those words, especially Om, because of its strong ties to Hinduism, can feel like they're invoking a different kind of spiritual energy.
Almost like it could be a conflict with their existing faith. Okay, so we've got the poses and the mantras. What's the third concern?
The third one is all about yoga's association with the New Age movement, and this is where things get really fascinating.
For sure. The New Age movement is, well, it's a bit of a wild card. It covers all sorts of spiritual and metaphysical beliefs. Some people see it as harmless, but for others, it's a slippery slope to all sorts of questionable things.
Exactly. And for some Christian communities, the New Age movement is seen as a direct threat. Like it could lead people astray from their faith.
So when they see yoga linked to that movement, alarm bells start going off.
Right. It's like they see it as a gateway to beliefs and practices that go against everything they believe in. But it's not that simple, is it?
Of course not. That's what makes this so intriguing. There's always another side to the story.
Right. And that's where this whole debate about whether yoga is inherently anti-Christian comes into play.
And the article doesn't shy away from that at all. It dives right in.
Exactly. It highlights those Christian leaders who are strongly warning against yoga. They say it could lead to idol worship. And some even go so far as to say it could open people up to demonic influences.
Demonic influences? Whoa, okay, that's pretty intense.
Yeah, it's a complex and very sensitive topic. Some point to the origins of certain poses, saying they were designed to honor Hindu deities. Others are worried about the altered states of consciousness you can reach through deep meditation, saying it could make you vulnerable to negative spiritual forces.
It's a lot to unpack. But honestly, I can imagine that anyone who is Christian and loves yoga is probably feeling pretty conflicted right now.
I can only imagine.
So where does that leave them? Is it a hard no on yoga, or is there some wiggle room?
Well, the article presents a pretty strong counterargument.
Okay, tell me more.
Many people argue that if you strip away all the spiritual stuff, yoga is simply a really beneficial form of exercise and a great way to relieve stress.
So it's like saying enjoying a cup of green tea doesn't automatically make you a Buddhist.
Exactly. And the article even talks about the rise of Christian yoga. They're adapting traditional yoga to incorporate scripture and prayers.
So they're finding ways to make it work within their belief system. That's fascinating. It seems like there isn't an easy answer to the question of whether yoga is okay for Christians or not.
And the article reflects that. It really comes down to the individual's intention. Why are you doing yoga? What are you hoping to get out of it? And do your reasons fit with your core beliefs?
It's like that saying, the poison is in the dose. Even something good can be harmful in the wrong amount.
Such a good point. So yeah, it seems like the article is saying that yoga isn't inherently good or evil. It's all about how you approach it.
Okay, things are starting to click for me. This is way more nuanced than just saying yoga is good or yoga is bad. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's talk about the science behind it all. I mean, the article talks about some pretty amazing benefits of yoga that are hard to ignore.
Absolutely. Even if you take all the spiritual stuff out of the equation, the physical and mental benefits are undeniable. We're talking about lower stress, reduced anxiety, better flexibility, improved posture, and even positive effects on your blood pressure and heart health.
It's like the ultimate 2-for-1 deal for your mind and body.
Exactly, and it's all backed up by scientific studies. The article mentions one study that found that doing yoga for just 12 weeks led to a 15% drop in stress hormone levels.
15%, that's huge. It's not just anecdotal evidence either. That's hard science proving that yoga can make a real difference.
Right, and it goes beyond just stress. The article talks about studies showing yoga can improve your sleep, make your muscles stronger and more flexible, and even boost your immune system.
Okay, color me impressed. I think even the biggest skeptics would have trouble arguing with that kind of data. But after all this discussion, after all the back and forth, are we finally ready to answer the question that started it all? Is yoga evil?
Well, based on everything we've read, the answer seems to be a pretty clear no.
A clear no. But what about all the concerns we've been talking about?
Those concerns are definitely valid, and it's important to acknowledge them. But the article's main point is that yoga, in its pure form, isn't about pushing any particular religious beliefs or doing anything harmful.
So it's not the yoga itself that could be the problem, it's how it's interpreted and practiced.
Exactly, and that's a really important distinction to make.
This is where I think things get really interesting. We've talked about the history, the controversy, the science, but it feels like there's a much bigger question here. How do we as individuals approach practices that come from different cultures and spiritual traditions, especially when those traditions might not fully align with our own beliefs?
Now that's a question worth exploring. And it's a conversation we need to have not just about yoga, but about so many other practices and traditions we encounter in today's world.
We live in a world where we're constantly bumping into new ideas and ways of thinking. And figuring out how to navigate that, how to respect other cultures while staying true to ourselves, that's a whole other deep dive.
That's where we're headed next. You know, picking up where we left off, I think it's important to address those specific concerns about yoga head on. Like, if I do a sun salutation, am I really worshiping a Hindu deity? Is it that black and white?
Right, because that seems to be at the root of the fear for a lot of people. But isn't that like saying, if you do jumping jacks, you're secretly worshiping some ancient god of athleticism?
It's a good point, and the article addresses this directly. It draws a really important distinction between the historical context of yoga, where those poses and practices came from, and how yoga is practiced today. Most yoga classes are focusing on the physical postures and the breath work, not on recreating ancient Hindu rituals.
That makes sense. It's like how so many cultures around the world have rituals and celebrations involving fire, bonfires, candle lighting ceremonies, fireworks. They all use fire, but don't necessarily share the same beliefs about fire or worship a fire god.
That's a great analogy. It shows how certain practices can be shared across cultures and how the meanings can evolve over time. And I think that same principle applies to the concern about chanting mantras.
Yeah, the article brought up how chanting Om or Namaste can feel uncomfortable for some people, especially if it clashes with their religious beliefs. I get it. It can feel like a conflict, like you're betraying your own faith.
Absolutely. It's a valid concern. But the article also offers a counterpoint that these mantras, even though they come from these ancient spiritual traditions, are often used in a more secular way in modern yoga. They're more like tools to focus your mind and help you be present, not necessarily declarations of faith.
It's kind of like saying amen at the end of a prayer. It has religious roots, for sure, but people from different faiths might use it in their own ways, or even in non-religious contexts, without necessarily subscribing to the original meaning.
Exactly. It comes back to intention. It's not just about the words themselves, but the meaning and intention you bring to them. And speaking of intention, that brings us to the yoga and New Age connection. I think this is a big one because it seems like a lot of the fear and skepticism comes from this association.
Right. People see yoga as this gateway to a whole other world of beliefs, and that can be scary, especially with the New Age movement, which can be, well, let's just say it's a bit of a mixed bag. You've got everything from harmless meditation practices to some pretty far out stuff.
I hear that. And that's why the article really emphasizes that yoga isn't inherently tied to New Age philosophy. You can totally practice yoga without buying into any specific spiritual or mystical beliefs.
It's like saying that just because some environmental activists practice yoga, that means yoga is automatically an environmentalist movement.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily connected. It's about the individual, not the practice itself.
Exactly. We can choose to incorporate practices into our lives without adopting the whole belief system they might be associated with. And I think that's a really empowering idea.
So if someone's listening to this and feeling totally torn, they love the benefits of yoga, but they're genuinely worried about the spiritual implications, what advice would you give them based on what we've learned?
I tell them to go back to that idea of intention, to really think about why they're drawn to yoga in the first place. What are they hoping to get out of it? Are there ways to tailor their practice to align with their own values and comfort levels?
So it's not like an all or nothing thing. Like maybe they choose a yoga class that focuses more on the physical aspects like strength and flexibility, and skips the chanting or spiritual discussions.
Right. Or they might want to check out Christian yoga, which we mentioned earlier. It's about finding a path that feels authentic and comfortable for them.
I love that. It's about taking ownership of your yoga practice and not letting it control you. But let's not forget about all the amazing benefits we talked about. I mean, the science behind yoga is pretty compelling.
Oh yeah, even if we completely ignore the spiritual side of things, yoga has so much to offer. Reduce stress and anxiety, improve flexibility and posture, better heart health. The list goes on and on.
And it's not just anecdotal. We're talking about real, scientifically backed benefits. The article even talked about studies showing how yoga can positively impact blood pressure, heart health, and even help with depression.
It's pretty amazing how much research supports the positive effects of yoga on both our bodies and minds. It really can be a powerful tool for well-being, regardless of your spiritual beliefs or background.
Okay, so we've covered the origins of yoga, the controversies surrounding it, the counter-arguments, and even the science. So, are we ready to circle back to that big, bold question, is yoga evil?
Based on everything we've explained in the article, I think it's safe to say that yoga, in and of itself, is not evil.
Okay, but. There's always a but, right?
But it's a practice that can be interpreted and practiced in so many different ways. For some people, it's deeply spiritual. For others, it's purely physical. It can be a source of conflict and tension, or it can be a source of healing and personal growth. It really depends on the individual.
So it all boils down to personal choice and intention.
Exactly. And that's a huge takeaway from all of this. It's about approaching yoga, and really any practice or belief system we encounter, with an open mind, a critical eye, and a willingness to understand both the good and the bad.
I love that. Be informed, be discerning, and make choices that feel right for you.
Perfectly put. That brings us to the bigger question we touched on earlier. How do we approach practices that come from different cultures, especially when those cultures hold beliefs that differ from our own? How do we navigate that?
That's where things get really interesting. It's a question that goes way beyond just yoga. It's about navigating a world full of different ideas and traditions and figuring out how to engage with it all.
And that's exactly what we'll be exploring in part 3 of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've come a long way. Ancient India, modern yoga studios, spiritual debates, the science of stretching. But as we wrap up, there's this one big question still swirling around in my head.
You're talking about that whole cultural sensitivity thing, right? Like,
yeah.
How do we approach practices and traditions from different cultures, especially if they have a spiritual or religious meaning that maybe we don't personally connect with?
Exactly. And it feels more relevant than ever these days. I mean, the world's getting smaller and smaller, right? We're constantly exposed to new ideas and practices, and it's not always easy to know what to do with them.
It's like that saying, take what you need and leave the rest. But how do you even know what you need? What's okay to take and what should you leave alone? How do you do it respectfully?
It's tricky, right? But the article kept coming back to yoga being a personal journey.
Right. Right. And I think that idea goes beyond just yoga. Anytime you're exploring something from another culture, it has to be personal. You have to figure out your own approach. There's no one right way to do it.
So it's not about following a bunch of rules, but about finding what works for you, what fits with your own values and helps you reach your goals, whether that's physical, mental, or spiritual.
You got it. It's about curiosity and being careful and thoughtful. Sometimes it might mean stepping outside your comfort zone, trying new things, maybe even realizing you had some wrong ideas before.
You know, it makes me think about food. Food from different cultures has become so normal for us now. Sushi, tacos, you name it. But there was a time when those foods were seen as totally strange and exotic.
I see what you mean. It's like how we've learned to appreciate all these different types of food. Maybe we can learn to appreciate and respect practices from different cultures too, you know?
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we approach these practices with that mindfulness and respect you talked about?
Well, the article gives a few good pointers. Education is a big one, taking the time to learn about where the practice came from, its history, what it means to the people who originated it.
So don't just jump into a yoga class without understanding the background of those poses and practices.
Exactly. Do your research. Read some books. Watch some documentaries. Talk to people from that culture who can give you a first-hand perspective.
It's like traveling to a new country and at least learning a few basic phrases in their language. It shows respect, right? Like you're making an effort to engage with their culture.
Perfect analogy. Another key point the article makes is about intention. Why are you drawn to this practice? What are you hoping to get from it? And are your reasons aligned with the values and principles of the culture where it originated?
So if you're into yoga just for the physical benefits, that's totally cool, but own it. Be upfront about that.
Right. And be mindful of how you're adapting the practice to fit your own needs and beliefs. Find that balance between honoring the tradition and making it work for you.
Kind of like taking a recipe and tweaking it to your liking. You're still respecting the original dish, but putting your own spin on it.
Exactly. And lastly, I think the most important advice is to be humble. Recognize that you're exploring something that's probably outside your own cultural experience. Be open to learning, to being challenged, to maybe even messing up along the way.
Don't pretend to know everything. Embrace the learning process, right?
Exactly. And I think that applies to more than just yoga. It's about approaching the world with curiosity and empathy, and really wanting to understand and connect with people who are different from us.
This whole deep dive has really made me think. It's challenged me to look deeper and consider what it really means to engage with practices from other cultures.
Me too. And that's what makes these deep dives so great, don't you think? That means you think critically and see things from different angles and just approach the world with more awareness and understanding.
I couldn't agree more. So to sum it all up, I want to leave our listeners with this. Yoga, like any practice from a culture that's not your own, isn't about blindly following rules or beliefs. It's about mindful exploration, self-discovery, and figuring out what works for you personally, all while respecting the roots of the tradition.
It's a journey worth taking, and that goes for anything that piques your interest and pushes you outside your comfort zone.
So keep exploring, keep your minds open, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.